Imagine being able to travel back in time to an empire that was once larger than almost all others, full of powerful kings, magnificent cities, and mysterious traditions. An empire whose influence can still be felt today. Welcome to the history of Persia. But before we begin, I have a question for you. What do you personally associate with Persia or today's Iran? Write it in the comments now. I'm curious what you think. In this series, we dive deep into a fascinating world, from the first advanced civilizations to legendary rulers to dramatic turning points that changed history forever. If you love such exciting historical stories, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video, so you won't miss an episode of this journey through time. So sit back, and let's dive into the history of one of the most impressive empires the world has ever seen. Chapter 1: The Cradle of Civilization. Long before great empires emerged, long before names like Cyrus II or Alexander the Great made history, the history of Persia began in a world that seems almost foreign to us today. A world of endless plains, rugged mountains, and scorching deserts, and yet it was one of the earliest places of human civilization. The Iranian highlands, which stretch between Mesopotamia in the west and the fertile regions of Central Asia in the east, were not an easy country. It was harsh, often merciless, characterized by extreme temperatures and unpredictable landscapes. But it was precisely these challenges that shaped the people who lived here. They had to learn to adapt, organize, and work with nature, skills that would later form the basis of one of history's greatest empires. The first settlements were established here over 7,000 years ago. Archaeological finds show that people began to settle down, domesticate animals, and cultivate crops. In places like Susa, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, one of the earliest advanced civilizations in the region developed. This early society was part of a larger cultural network linked to the civilizations of Mesopotamia, especially the Sumerians. But Persia was never simply an appendage of its neighbors. An independent identity developed early on. This was particularly evident in the culture of the Achaemenids, who lived in the southwest of present-day Iran. The Empire of Elam was a major power for thousands of years. It was in constant exchange, and often in conflict, with the great cities of Mesopotamia such as Ur and Babylon. The Elam created their own language, their own script, and their own religious world. Their gods were different from those of the Sumerians and Babylonians, and their art had its own aesthetic. At the same time, they were adept at adopting foreign influences and integrating them into their own culture. This ability to combine the self with the foreign was to become a central feature of the later Persian civilization. While in the west Mesopotamia with its rivers Euphrates and Tigris offered fertile soils, life on the Iranian plateau was more difficult. Water was often scarce, and agriculture required sophisticated techniques. One of the most significant innovations was the so-called kanat system, underground channels that channeled water from the mountains to arid regions. This technology made it possible to practice agriculture even in inhospitable areas and to supply larger settlements. But the history of Persia is not only a history of cities and technologies. It is also a story of movements, of people who came and went, of peoples who mixed and formed new identities. Around 2000 BC, Indo-Iranian groups began to migrate to the region. These nomads brought with them new languages, new religious ideas, and new social structures. These early Iranian tribes initially lived as shepherds and warriors. They moved through the vast plains, following their herds and adapting to the changing conditions. But over time, they also began to settle down and form solid communities. These groups would later give rise to the Medes and the Persians, two peoples who would have a significant influence on the history of the region. The world in which these developments took place was characterized by competition and exchange at the same time. Trade routes connected the Iranian plateau with Mesopotamia, India, and Central Asia. These routes were used to transport not only goods, metals, textiles, precious stones, but also ideas, technologies, and cultural influences. Thus, Persia developed into a cultural hub. Different worlds met here: the urban advanced civilizations of Mesopotamia, the nomadic traditions of the steppe, and the early civilizations of the Indus Valley. This diversity made the region dynamic, but also full of conflict. Conflicts were a constant companion of early history. Empires emerged, expanded, and disintegrated again. Cities were conquered, destroyed, and rebuilt. But out of this constant change emerged something enduring, a cultural continuity that lasted for thousands of years. A particularly fascinating aspect of this early period is the role of religion. Even in the earliest cultures, it played a central role in people's everyday lives. Natural forces were seen as divine, and rituals were supposed to ensure the balance between humans and the environment. Later, with the development of more complex societies, more sophisticated religious systems emerged that also legitimized political power. This combination of religion and rule would later take on a new form in Zoroastrianism, a religion that would have a profound influence on Persian identity. But in this early phase, the religious landscape was still diverse and changing. The social structure also continued to develop. Small communities became more complex societies with clear hierarchies. Elites emerged that controlled power and resources, while other groups were responsible for agriculture, crafts, or military tasks. Over time, these structures became more stable, and larger political entities began to form. This was the beginning of a process that would eventually lead to the emergence of the first great empires. It is precisely this ability to adapt that holds one of the keys to understanding Persian history. The people of the Iranian plateau were not passive observers of their environment, they actively shaped it. They developed technologies, organized their societies, and created cultural forms of expression that continue to have an impact today. When we look at the history of Persia today, we often see the great empires, the powerful kings, and the spectacular buildings. But none of this would have been possible without the long, often invisible development that began in this early period. Chapter 1 is therefore more than just an introduction, it is the foundation. Here the conditions were created for everything that was to follow, for the rise of the Medes, for the conquests of the Persians, and for the emergence of an empire that would change the world permanently. And perhaps this is precisely where the greatest fascination lies, that one of the most important civilizations in human history emerged from a seemingly inhospitable landscape, from small settlements and simple communities. The history of Persia does not begin with a king, but with people. People who have learned to survive, adapt, and shape their world. And it is precisely this story that has only just begun. Chapter 2: The Origin of the Medes. While the first cultures developed on the Iranian highlands over thousands of years, cities emerged and fell apart again. A new force slowly began to form, a force that emerged from the vast plains, the mountains, and the migrating tribes. It was not a sudden birth of an empire, but a gradual process. A change that arose from movement. And at the center of this change were the Medes. The Medes were not a people in the classical sense, at least not at the beginning. Rather, they were an association of different Iranian tribes that developed a common identity over time. Their origins go back to the Indo-Iranian groups that had already immigrated to the territory of present-day Iran in the 2nd millennium BC. These groups initially lived as nomads, shepherds, warriors, survivalists. They knew no fixed borders, no cities in the modern sense. Their lives were determined by the seasons, by the movements of their herds, and by the challenges of nature. But it was precisely in this mobile way of life that their strength lay. They were adaptable, resilient, and above all, free. Over time, these tribes began to settle in the northwest of the Iranian plateau, in a region protected by mountains while providing access to important trade routes. This geographical location played a decisive role. It turned the Medes into mediators between the great empires of Mesopotamia in the west and the vast landscapes of Central Asia in the east. But this situation brought not only opportunities, but also dangers. For in the west stretched a powerful empire that was considered one of the most dominant forces in the known world at that time, the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians were known for their military strength, their tight organization, and their often brutal rule. For the Medes, this initially meant one thing: subordination. For a long time, The Median tribes were under the influence of the Assyrians. They had to pay tributes, were drawn into military conflicts, and had little political room for maneuver. But at the same time, they learned. They observed the Assyrian administrative structures, their warfare and their way of exercising power. And it was precisely this knowledge that was to become decisive later. While the Assyrians were at the height of their power, changes began to take place in secret. The Median tribes became more numerous, their structures more complex. The first beginnings of political organization emerged from loose tribal associations. Leaders gained influence. Decisions were made in a more coordinated manner. One name comes up again and again in this context: Darius. The Greek historian Herodotus reports of him as the first king of the Medes, a man who brought order to the previously fragmented structure. Whether Darius actually existed in this form or whether his story is partly mythologically exaggerated is difficult to say today. But the narrative itself is revealing. For it shows that the Medes began to understand themselves as a unit. According to tradition, Darius was a just judge whose reputation spread widely. In a time when conflicts between tribes were frequent, he gained trust and authority through his decisions. After all, he is said to have been elected king, not by conquest, but by recognition. A remarkable thought, power that is not only based on strength, but on legitimacy. Darius marks the beginning of the idea of a Median state. A central authority that works across different tribes. A capital, Ecbatana, that serves as a political and symbolic center. Ecbatana, today's Hamadan, became a place of power. Surrounded by walls, organized in concentric rings, the city was not only an administrative center, but also an expression of order in a previously fragmented world. But the true strength of the Medes only became apparent in the next phase of their development. The Assyrian Empire, which had dominated the Middle East for centuries, began to weaken. Internal conflicts, overstretching and external attacks took their toll on him, and the Medes recognized their chance. Under the leadership of Xerxes, they developed into a serious military power. Xerxes reformed the army, reorganized it, and made it more efficient. He divided the troops into specialized units, a step that significantly increased the striking power. But Xerxes did not act alone. He entered into an alliance with the Babylonians, another opponent of Assyria. Together, they led a decisive campaign against the Assyrian heartland. In 612 BC, they achieved their goal, the conquest and destruction of Nineveh, the Assyrian capital. This event marks a turning point in the history of the Middle East. With the fall of Assyria, one of the greatest powers in the world at that time disappeared, and in their place came new forces, among them the Medes. Suddenly, they were no longer just a union of tribes. They were an empire. The Median Empire extended over large parts of the Iranian plateau and beyond. It controlled important trade routes, had military strength, and had central leadership. It was the first major Iranian power in history. But despite this rise, much remained in flux. The Median structures were less centralized than those of later empires. Local leaders retained influence, and the unit was often based more on alliances than strict control. This flexibility was a strength on the one hand, but it also made the empire vulnerable, because a new force was already growing inside. In the south of the Median sphere of influence lived the Persians, another Iranian people who were closely related to the Medes. For a long time, they were under Media domination, but they also developed their own structures, their own leaders, their own ambitions. One of these leaders was to change history forever. His name was Cyrus II, but his story belongs in the next chapter. Chapter 2 thus ends at a crucial point. The Medes have managed to form an empire from a multitude of tribes. They overthrew a world power and took their own place in history. But at the same time, perhaps unconsciously, they have created the basis for their own replacement. For what they have built will soon be taken over by an even greater force. And this is exactly where the tragedy and at the same time the significance of the Medes lies. They were the first. The trailblazers. Those who have shown that more can emerge from the peoples of the Iranian plateau than just loose tribal associations. They were the beginning of an empire that would change the world. And her story is a crucial chapter on the way there. Chapter 3: The Rise of the Achaemenids. The world left behind by the Medes was a world in upheaval. An empire had emerged, powerful, but not unshakable. Tensions were brewing beneath the surface, power relations were shifting, and in the south, in the territory of the Persians, something began to contract that would soon shake the entire known world. This is where one of the most important figures in history enters the stage: Cyrus II, also known as Cyrus the Great. His origins are still surrounded by legends today. Some traditions report that he was the grandson of the Median king Astyages. A prophecy is said to have predicted that this child would one day overthrow her grandfather. Out of fear, Astyages allegedly had the infant killed, but the child survived. Secretly raised, far from the royal court, Cyrus grew up in simple circumstances. It is difficult to say whether this story is historically correct or belongs more to the realm of mythology. But it fulfills an important function. It shows Cyrus as a figure of fate, as someone who became a ruler not only through power, but through destiny. What we know with greater certainty is that Cyrus was a Persian prince from the Achaemenid dynasty. The Persians themselves were originally vassals of the Medes, i.e. subordinate. But under Cyrus, this relationship began to change fundamentally. Around 550 BC, there was a decisive break. Cyrus rose up against the Median rule. But this was no ordinary uprising. It was a strategically cleverly prepared takeover. Many Median nobles defected to him, dissatisfied with their own king. When it finally came to the confrontation, the result was almost inevitable. Astyages was defeated. The Median Empire fell, not by external enemies, but by the hand of one of its own subjects. But what Cyrus did after that was extraordinary. He did not destroy the Median Empire. He integrated it. Instead of taking revenge or smashing the existing structures, he took it over. Medical officials remained in their positions, the administration was continued, and much was also culturally preserved. Cyrus understood something that many rulers before and after him did not understand. Stability does not come from destruction, but from integration. This laid the foundation for a new empire, the Achaemenid Empire. But Cyrus did not stand still. His gaze was directed to the west. There was another powerful kingdom, Lydia, under the rule of the famous king Croesus. Lydia was rich, strategically important, and controlled parts of Asia Minor. A conflict ensued. Croesus, convinced of his own strength, sought the decisive battle. But Cyrus once again proved to be superior, not only militarily, but also tactically. In the Battle of Sardis, Croesus was defeated, and Lydia fell into the hands of the Persians. Cyrus now controlled large parts of Asia Minor, a decisive step towards a world empire. But perhaps the most symbolic moment of his rise followed a little later. In 539 BC, Cyrus marched against Babylon. At that time, Babylon was not only a powerful city, but also a cultural and religious center of enormous importance. Many rulers had tried to conquer it, but only a few had succeeded. Cyrus succeeded in something that seems almost unbelievable. He took Babylon almost without a fight. The exact circumstances are still the subject of discussion today. Some sources report that the Euphrates was diverted so that the troops could enter the city through the riverbed. Others emphasize that the people of Babylon received Cyrus as a liberator because they were dissatisfied with their own king. Whatever the exact truth, the result was clear. Babylon fell, and with it another center of the ancient world. But once again, Cyrus showed a policy that distinguished him from many other conquerors. He did not present himself as a destroyer, but as a legitimate ruler. He respected local religions, restored temples, and allowed deported peoples to return to their homeland. A famous example of this is the return of the Jews from the Babylonian exile, an event that has even been recorded in religious texts. This policy made Cyrus not only a successful conqueror, but an accepted ruler. His empire continued to grow. It stretched from Central Asia to the Mediterranean, from the borders of India to Egypt, an area of unprecedented size. But a great empire is more than just conquered land. It needs structure. And this is exactly where the true achievement of the Achaemenids becomes apparent. Under Cyrus and his successors, an administrative system began to develop that was far ahead of its time. The empire was divided into provinces, so-called satrapies. Each was administered by a governor who was responsible for taxes, order, and military security. At the same time, there were control mechanisms to prevent abuse of power. Inspectors, often referred to as the eyes and ears of the king, traveled through the empire and reported directly to the central authority. This combination of decentralization and control was crucial to the stability of the empire. Enormous investments have also been made in infrastructure. Roads were built, including the famous King's Road, which connected the empire from Sardis to Susa. Messages could thus be transported over long distances in an astonishingly short time. An early postal system emerged, efficient, organized, and reliable. But perhaps even more important was something else, a common idea. The Achaemenid Empire was not a homogeneous state. It consisted of many peoples, languages, and cultures. But instead of suppressing these differences, they were integrated. Persian rule was not based on forced equality, but on accepted diversity. This made the empire stable, but also unique. Of course, not everything was ideal. Power struggles, uprisings, and conflicts continue to be part of reality. Such a large empire was difficult to control, and not all regions accepted Persian rule without resistance. But compared to many other empires of its time, the Achaemenid Empire was remarkably stable. Cyrus himself experienced the height of his power, but not his end. He died around 530 BC, probably in a campaign in the east. His death did not mark the end of the empire, but the beginning of a new phase. Because what he had built up was bigger than a single person. His legacy lived on, in the structure of the empire, in the idea of rule, and in the memory of a king unlike many others. A king who not only conquered, but united. Chapter 3 is therefore more than just the story of an ascension. It is the story of a transformation. A regional people became a world power. An uprising became an empire. And a ruler became a legend. But every empire, no matter how large it may be, sooner or later faces new challenges. And in the next chapter, we'll see how this massive empire continues to grow, but also reaches its first major limits. Chapter 4: The Persian Empire under Darius and Xerxes. When Cyrus II died, he left behind no ordinary kingdom. He left behind an empire, huge, diverse, and full of opportunities, but also full of challenges. His son Cambyses II initially continued the expansion and even conquered Egypt. But after his death, the empire began to falter. Intrigues, uprisings, and power struggles shook the still young order. At that very moment, a man appeared on the scene who was not only to stabilize the empire, but to raise it to a completely new level: Darius I, also known as Darius the Great. His path to power was anything but easy. Darius was not a direct son of Cyrus, but belonged to a side line of the Achaemenid family. In order to secure the throne, he first had to prevail against rivals. A famous inscription, the so-called Behistun inscription, tells of his fight against an alleged usurper who pretended to be the rightful king. Darius defeated him and several other insurgents. But these struggles were more than just power struggles. They were a test of whether the huge empire could be held together at all. And Darius passed that test. No sooner had he secured control than he began one of the most impressive reforms of antiquity. He realized that an empire of this size could not be governed by military strength alone. It needed structure, organization, and above all a functioning system. The empire was divided into about 20 satrapies, large administrative districts, each of which was led by a satrap. These governors had far-reaching powers, but they were under constant surveillance. Darius created a sophisticated control system to ensure that no one became too powerful. This balance between local autonomy and central control was crucial. But Darius went even further. He introduced a uniform tax system based on fixed taxes. Each satrapy knew exactly what it had to do. This made the revenues predictable and strengthened the economic basis of the empire. He also minted a single currency, the Darius, a gold coin that was accepted throughout the empire. This made trading easier, faster, and safer. And then there was the infrastructure. Darius had a road network built that was second to none. The most famous of these roads was the King's Road, which stretched for more than 2,500 kilometers, from Sardis in Asia Minor to Susa in the heart of the empire. Postal stations were built along this route, where riders passed on messages. Thus, an embassy could cross the entire empire in a few days, a logistical masterpiece. But all these reforms had one goal: stability. Darius didn't just want to rule, he wanted to create a permanent system. And it worked. Under his rule, the Persian Empire reached a new heyday. Cities grew, trade flourished, cultures developed. At the same time, the diversity of the empire was preserved. Different languages, religions, and traditions were not suppressed, but accepted. But with growing power came new conflicts. The empire increasingly turned its gaze to the west, towards Greece. The Greek city-states were unlike anything the Persians had known before. They were not centralized empires, but independent polis, each with their own government, their own interests. Some of them, especially the Ionian cities on the coast of Asia Minor, were already under Persian rule. But this rule was not without controversy. In 499 BC, the so-called Ionian Revolt occurred. Greek cities rose up against Persian control, supported by Athens and Eretria. For Darius, this was more than just a local conflict. It was a challenge to his authority. The uprising was crushed. But Darius wanted more. He wanted to set an example. In 490 BC, he sent an army to Greece. The famous Battle of Marathon took place. There, Persian troops met a comparatively small Athenian army. What followed was surprising. The Greeks won. For the huge Persian Empire, this was not an existential defeat, but symbolically it was significant. For the first time, a small independent people had successfully stood up to the power of the empire. Darius immediately began to prepare a new campaign. But he was not to live to see it. He died in 486 BC, and his son took over the reign, Xerxes I. Xerxes inherited not only a vast empire, but also an open conflict. He continued his father's plans, and prepared one of the largest military actions of antiquity. His goal: to finally subjugate Greece. The preparations were enormous. A huge army was assembled, consisting of soldiers from all parts of the empire: Persians, Medes, Egyptians, Babylonians, and many more. It was a reflection of the diversity of the empire. The campaign was also logistically impressive. Xerxes had bridges built over the Hellespont to bring his troops from Asia to Europe. Canals were dug, supply routes organized. The campaign began in 480 BC. The first major encounter took place at Thermopylae, a narrow passage, defended by a small Greek force under King Leonidas of Sparta. Despite being outnumbered, the Greeks put up fierce resistance. But eventually they were overwhelmed. The way to Greece was clear. Xerxes moved on, conquered Athens, and had the city burned down. It seemed as if the fate of Greece would be decided. But then came the turnaround. In the naval battle of Salamis, the Greeks succeeded in defeating the Persian fleet. The narrow waters played into their hands. The larger Persian fleet could not play to its strength. Xerxes withdrew. Part of his army remained behind, but he was also defeated later, in the Battle of Plataea. The campaign had failed. For the Persian Empire, this was a setback, but not a collapse. The empire remained, strong and influential. But the limit was reached. Greece remained independent. And so it became clear, even an empire of this size had limits. Under Xerxes and his successors, the empire remained, but the dynamics changed. Expansion took a back seat, stability became more important. At the same time, new tensions began to develop, within the empire and on its borders. Chapter 4 shows us a crucial phase of Persian history. It is the time when the empire reaches its peak, in size, organization, and power. But it is also the time when the first borders become visible. The reforms of Darius made the empire strong. The campaigns of Xerxes showed his reach. But the encounter with Greece made it clear that not everything can be conquered. And this is exactly where the next phase of the story begins, a phase in which not only external enemies, but also internal developments will play an increasingly important role. Chapter 5: Religion and Worldview. When we look at the vast expanse of the Persian Empire, its streets, its cities, its armies, we see above all power, organization, and political greatness. But behind all this was something invisible, something deeper, an idea of how the world works. A worldview that shaped not only people's thinking, but also the way an empire was governed. At the center of this worldview was one of the most influential religious ideas of antiquity, Zoroastrianism. This religion is inseparably linked with a mysterious figure, Zarathustra, also called Zoroaster in Greek. We know surprisingly little about his life with certainty. When exactly he lived is still disputed today. Some date it far before the Achaemenids, others see it closer to their time. But regardless of the exact time, one thing is clear: his teachings fundamentally changed the intellectual landscape of Persia. Zarathustra focused on a radical idea: the world is a scene of a cosmic struggle. On one side is Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, the highest divine being who stands for truth, order, and light. On the other side is Ungramenu, the spirit of destruction, who is responsible for lies, chaos, and darkness. This juxtaposition was more than just a religious concept. It was a moral order. Every man, Zarathustra taught, stands between these two forces. Every decision, every action contributes to which side is strengthened. Good and evil are not abstract ideas. They are real forces that shape the world. In this way, Zoroastrianism brought something new to the religious way of thinking of the time, a clear ethical responsibility of the individual. In many earlier religions, the main aim was to appease the gods, through sacrifices, rituals, and prayers. In Zoroastrianism, on the other hand, the focus was on human action. Good thoughts, good words, good deeds, this principle became a leitmotif. But this religion was not only of enormous importance individually, but also politically. The Achaemenid kings, especially Darius I, repeatedly referred to Ahura Mazda in their inscriptions. They saw their rule not only as a worldly power, but as part of a divine order. The king was not just a ruler, he was a keeper of the truth. In the famous Behistun inscription, Darius describes how, with the help of Ahura Mazda, he restored order after the lie had threatened the empire. This clearly shows how closely religion and politics were connected. But despite this religious basis, the Persian Empire was remarkably tolerant. Unlike many other empires, the Persians did not try to impose their religion. They respected the beliefs of the conquered peoples, supported local temples, and perpetuated religious traditions. This was no coincidence. It was part of a conscious system. An empire as diverse as the Persian could only function if it accepted differences. Religion was not used as a tool of oppression, but as a means of integration. This attitude made the empire stable, and distinguished it from many other powers. But back to Zoroastrianism itself. A central element of this religion is the concept of time. The world, it was believed, was moving towards a goal. In the end, the battle between good and evil will be decided. The forces of light will triumph, darkness will be overcome. It is one of the earliest known notions of an end times, a final renewal of the world. The idea of a last judgment can also be found here. After death, a person's soul is judged. Good deeds lead to a positive fate, bad deeds to a negative one. These concepts had an enormous influence, not only on Persia, but later also on other religions. Many elements that we know today from Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, heaven and hell, angels and demons, a final judgment, have parallels in Zoroastrian thought. This shows how far-reaching these ideas were. But religion in the Persian Empire was not only philosophy, it was also practice. Fire played a central role. It was considered a symbol of purity and truth. In fire temples, it was kept burning constantly, as a visible sign of the divine presence. But the fire itself was not worshipped, it was a symbol, not a god. Nature was also treated with respect. Earth, water, and air were considered pure and were not allowed to be contaminated. This idea even had an impact on funeral rituals. The dead were not buried or cremated, but placed on so-called towers of silence, so that the elements were not contaminated. This practice may seem strange to us today, but it shows how consistently the worldview has been implemented. Another important aspect was the role of the priests. They were not only religious leaders, but also guardians of knowledge. They preserved the sacred texts, performed rituals, and passed on the teachings. But unlike in some other cultures, they did not have absolute control over society. Political power continued to lie with the king. This separation, though not completely, prevented religion from becoming the sole power base. The interplay of religion and politics in the Persian Empire was therefore complex. There was a common basis, a common worldview, but at the same time there was room for diversity. And this is precisely one of the greatest strengths of this civilization. Because an empire can be conquered by weapons, but it can only be held together by ideas. Zoroastrianism offered such an idea. He gave people orientation, explained the world and its conflicts, and created a moral foundation on which a society could be built. But like any system, this one was not immutable. Over time, new influences, new currents, new challenges developed. Other religions were added, ideas were mixed, and the original worldview was further developed. But in the Achaemenid period, Zoroastrianism was a central part of Persian identity. He shaped not only the faith, but also the way of thinking. And maybe that's exactly his greatest legacy. Not only to have created a religion, but an idea that every person is part of a greater whole. That every action counts. And that the world does not simply exist, but is shaped. Chapter 5 thus takes us into the interior of the Persian Empire, into its thoughts, its values, its convictions. Because to understand how an empire works, it is not enough to know its armies or its kings. You have to understand what his people believed in. And that's exactly what we've started now. Chapter 6: The Fall of Alexander the Great. The Persian Empire of the Achaemenids had grown over generations. It had survived crises, crushed uprisings, and established itself as one of the most stable great powers in the ancient world. From the Indus to the Aegean stretched an empire held together by administration, infrastructure, and a remarkable cultural openness. But it was precisely this size that also brought with it a creeping danger. Because the bigger an empire becomes, the more difficult it becomes to keep it together. After the time of Xerxes I, the balance in the interior of the empire changed. The great expansions were over, and instead administration and securing power came to the fore. But this is exactly where the first cracks began to appear. The power of the satraps, the provincial governors, increased. In some regions, they developed an almost independent authority. Intrigues at court became more frequent. Power struggles within the royal family destabilized the central leadership. The empire continued to function, but it was no longer as dynamic as before. At the same time, the world outside the Persian borders was also changing. In the West, in Greece, the Persian Wars had given rise to a new self-confidence. The Greek city-states, especially Athens, continued to develop culturally and politically, but they were not united. Rivalries, especially between Athens and Sparta, led to long and exhausting conflicts. A new power was to emerge from this fragmented Greece, not from the south, but from the north. Macedonia. Under King Philip II of Macedonia, this previously rather insignificant kingdom became a military superpower. Philip reformed the army, introduced the famous phalanx, and brought the Greek city-states under his control. But he was no longer able to achieve his greatest goal. He was murdered. His son took over the reign. And this son was no ordinary king. Alexander the Great was young, ambitious, and driven by a vision. He didn't just want to rule, he wanted to make history. His goal was clear: the Persian Empire. His campaign began in 334 BC. With a comparatively small army, Alexander crossed the Hellespont and set foot on Asian soil. It was a symbolic act, a conscious step into the world of the Persian Empire. The first major confrontation took place on the Granicos River. There, Alexander's army met Persian troops and won. It was the prelude to a series of successes that hardly anyone would have thought possible. But the decisive moment came a little later. In the Battle of Issos, Alexander met the Persian great king himself for the first time, Darius III. The Persian army was numerically superior, but the terrain was narrow, and Alexander cleverly took advantage of it. In a bold attack, he broke through the lines and forced Darius to flee. It wasn't just a military defeat, it was a psychological blow. The great king had left the battlefield. Alexander continued his campaign. He moved along the Mediterranean coast, secured important cities, and cut off Persia from its western territories. The siege of Tyre in particular showed his determination, a seemingly impregnable island city that finally fell after months of siege. Then he turned south, to Egypt. There he was received not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The Egyptians saw him as a liberator from Persian rule. Alexander made clever use of this and even had himself crowned pharaoh. But his gaze remained fixed on Persia. In 331 BC, the decisive battle took place. At Gaugamela, the two armies met again. Darius III had assembled a huge army, perhaps the largest the Persian Empire had ever raised. The plain of Gaugamela was deliberately chosen to give space to the Persian cavalry. But once again Alexander's tactical genius showed itself. He broke through the Persian line, aimed directly at Darius, and again the great king fled. With this flight, the fate of the Achaemenid Empire was sealed. Alexander moved on to the heart of the empire. Babylon fell without a fight. Susa opened his gates. And finally he reached Persepolis, the magnificent ceremonial capital of the Persians. What happened next is still controversial today. Persepolis was set on fire. Whether out of revenge, as a symbolic act, or in the intoxication of a party, the reasons are unclear. But the effect was clear: a central symbol of Persian power was destroyed. It was the end of an era. Darius III fled further east, but he was eventually murdered by his own people. When Alexander found his body, he had it buried with honor, an act that was intended to show that he now saw himself as the legitimate successor. Because that was exactly Alexander's goal. He didn't just want to destroy the Persian Empire, he wanted to take it over. And in a way, he did just that. He adopted Persian clothing, integrated Persian nobles into his administration, and tried to create a link between Greek and Persian cultures. This policy was not without controversy. Many of his own officers saw this as a betrayal of their traditions. But Alexander thought bigger. He wanted an empire based not on separation, but on fusion. An empire without clear boundaries between conquerors and conquered. But this vision remained unfinished. In 323 BC, Alexander died suddenly in Babylon. He was only 32 years old. With his death, the empire he had built up fell into several parts. His generals, the so-called Diadochi, fought for the succession. The Persian Empire, as it had existed under the Achaemenids, had finally disappeared. But his traces remained. Many of the structures that Cyrus and Darius had created were taken over by Alexander and his successors. The idea of a large, diverse empire lived on. Chapter 6 is therefore not only the story of a downfall. It is the story of an encounter. Two worlds collide, the Persian and the Greek. Two systems, two cultures, two ideas of power. And something new emerges from this encounter. The Achaemenid Empire falls. But his ideas survive. And that's exactly where its true greatness lies. Chapter 7, the Seleucids and Hellenism. The death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC not only ended the life of one of the greatest conquerors in history, it also began a new chapter for the world he had left behind. His empire, which stretched from Greece to India, was too large, too diverse, and too fragile to be held together by a single successor. There was no clear heir. What followed was a power struggle between his generals, the so-called Diadochi. Each of them was trying to secure a piece of the vast empire. It was a time full of intrigues, alliances, and wars. And out of this chaos finally arose a new political entity that was to be of decisive importance for the history of Persia, the Seleucid Empire. It was founded by Seleucus I Nicator, one of Alexander's generals. Seleucus was not just a warrior, he was also a skillful strategist and politician. After years of struggle, he managed to gain control over large parts of the former Persian Empire, especially Mesopotamia, Persia, and large parts of Central Asia. He thus became the ruler of an area that had once been the heart of the Achaemenid power. But this new realm was different. It was no longer a purely Persian empire, and not a purely Greek one either. It was a hybrid entity. The rulers were of Macedonian Greek origin, their language was Greek, their cultural roots lay in the world of the Hellenistic tradition. At the same time, they ruled over a predominantly non-Greek population, Persians, Babylonians, Medes, and many other peoples. This mixture led to one of the most fascinating cultural developments of antiquity, Hellenism. Hellenism was more than just the spread of Greek culture. It was a process of mixing. Greek art, architecture, philosophy, and language spread over large parts of the former Persian Empire. New cities were founded, often based on the Greek model, with an agora, theater, and grammar school. One of the most famous was Seleucia on the Tigris, which became one of the most important metropolises of the empire. But at the same time, the local culture remained. Persian traditions did not simply disappear. They adapted, changed, and in turn influenced the Greek elements. A new mixed culture emerged, neither completely Greek nor completely Persian. This cultural fusion was evident in many areas. In art, for example, Greek forms were combined with Oriental motifs. In religion, gods were equated with each other or worshipped side by side. A Greek god could suddenly take on characteristics of a Persian god, and vice versa. This mixture was also noticeable in everyday life. The upper class often spoke Greek, while the population continued to use their local languages. Administration and trade increasingly functioned on a common cultural basis that included Greek elements. But despite this cultural dynamic, the Seleucid Empire was not politically stable. It was too big, too diverse, and too difficult to control. Early on, there were uprisings and splits. In the eastern regions, far from the centers of power, control was particularly weak. Local rulers gained influence, and some territories broke away from the empire altogether. An example of this is the Kingdom of Bactria in present-day Afghanistan, which became independent in the 3rd century BC and became a major Hellenistic power in its own right. There were also problems in the West. The conflicts with other Hellenistic empires, especially the Ptolemies in Egypt, led to constant wars. Resources were tied up, stability suffered. And inside, integration remained incomplete. For despite all the cultural mixing, there were still differences, social, linguistic, and political. The Greek Macedonian elite often remained separated from the native population. This led to tensions that broke out again and again. Another decisive factor was the distance. The Seleucid Empire was one of the largest empires of its time, but that was exactly what was its undoing. Communication over long distances was difficult, decisions took a long time, and local problems could quickly develop into major crises. While the Seleucids tried to hold their empire together, a new force began to form in the background. A force that was deeply rooted in Iranian tradition. In the northeast of the empire, in the region of Parthia, a people arose that would soon play a decisive role, the Parthians. At first, they were only a marginal phenomenon, another people among many. But they cleverly exploited the weakness of the Seleucids. Step by step, they expanded their influence, conquered territories, and gained power. For the Seleucids, this was initially only one of many challenges. But it was to prove to be one of the most consequential. While they fought against other Hellenistic powers in the west, they increasingly lost control in the east. The empire began to disintegrate. Territory was lost piece by piece. The former unity gave way to a fragmented reality. Local rulers, new empires, and old traditions regained importance. But despite this political decline, the Seleucid period remains of enormous importance, because it changed the cultural landscape permanently. Hellenism left traces that went far beyond the political existence of the Seleucid Empire. Cities, ideas, art forms, and ways of thinking spread and influenced the development of the region for centuries. Later Persian history was also shaped by it. The Parthians, who were eventually to replace the Seleucid Empire, adopted many of these elements, and combined them with their own traditions. This created a new phase of history in which Alexander's legacy and the roots of Persia merged. Chapter 7 thus shows us a transitional period. A time in which a great empire emerges and falls apart again. A time when cultures meet, mingle, and produce something new. And a time in which the forces that will shape the next epoch are already forming. The Seleucids were not the heirs of the Persian Empire in the classical sense, but they were a crucial link between the past and the future, between Persia and Greece, between tradition and change. And this is precisely where its historical significance lies. Chapter 8: The Parthian Empire. While the Seleucid Empire slowly lost stability and disintegrated under the pressure of internal conflicts and external threats, a new power emerged in the east, quietly, at first almost unnoticed, but with a dynamic that was to change the power structure of the entire region. This new force was the Parthians. Its origin lies in the steppes and peripheral areas of northeastern Iran, in a region that was long considered more peripheral. But it was precisely this situation that made them independent, mobile, and difficult to control. The Parthians belonged to the Iranian peoples and were culturally closer to the old traditions of the Iranian highlands than to the Greek-influenced world of the Seleucids. They were led by a dynasty that later became known as the Arsacids. The founder of this line was Xerxes I. Not much is known about it in detail, but its importance is undeniable. In the 3rd century BC, he rose up against Seleucid control in the Parthia region and declared his independence. What initially seemed like a local uprising soon developed into a long-term buildup of power. Because the Parthians had a decisive advantage. They were organized differently. In contrast to the highly centralized empires before them, both the Achaemenid Empire and the Seleucid Empire, the Parthians relied on a loose structure. Their empire was less a unified state than a network of loyal noble families and regional rulers. This structure had advantages and disadvantages. It made the empire flexible and resistant to external attacks. At the same time, however, it made clear central control more difficult. But in the phase of her rise, it was precisely this flexibility that was decisive. The Parthians consistently exploited the weakness of the Seleucids. While they were involved in conflicts in the west, the Parthians expanded their territory step by step. They conquered important regions in Iran and finally advanced as far as Mesopotamia, the old center of power. A decisive moment was the capture of Seleucia and later Ctesiphon, which became the new capital. The Parthians thus controlled not only important trade routes, but also one of the economic heart of the region. But the Parthians were not only skilled strategists, they were also feared warriors. Their military strength lay above all in their cavalry. Particularly well known were the so-called Parthian horsemen, who mastered an unusual tactic in battle, the famous Parthian shot. In doing so, they rode away from the enemy, seemingly fleeing, turned around in the saddle and shot arrows back, a technique that often surprised and confused their enemies. This type of warfare made them particularly effective against cumbersome infantry armies. And that was exactly what was to be shown in one of the most famous conflicts of antiquity. With the rise of the Parthians, a new great power appeared on the scene, a power that was on a par with the Parthians and was to compete with them for centuries, the Roman Empire. The encounter between Parthians and Romans was inevitable. Both empires expanded, both wanted influence and control, especially over the rich areas of Mesopotamia. In 53 BC, there was a decisive confrontation. The Roman general Marcus Licinius Crassus led a large army into the territory of the Parthians. He was one of the most powerful men in Rome and sought military glory. But he underestimated his opponent. In the Battle of Carrhae, he met the Parthian troops and suffered a crushing defeat. The Roman army was crushed, Crassus himself killed. It was one of the heaviest defeats in Roman military history. This victory made the Parthians a recognized great power. From then on, they were on an equal footing with Rome. But the relationship between the two empires remained tense. Conflicts, border shifts, and diplomatic tensions have repeatedly occurred. Mesopotamia became a contested space between two empires. But despite these external conflicts, the Parthian Empire was not free of problems internally. The decentralized structure, which had been an advantage at the beginning, became increasingly challenging. Powerful noble families had great influence and were sometimes able to oppose the king. Successions to the throne were often disputed, and power struggles within the dynasty were not uncommon. This instability weakened the empire from within. But at the same time, a separate, unmistakable culture developed. The Parthians adopted many elements from the Hellenistic world, especially in art and architecture. At the same time, they preserved Iranian traditions and combined the two into a new style. An example of this is the architecture with its large iwans, open halls with vaulted roofs, which would later also play an important role in Islamic architecture. This mixture is also evident in clothing, art, and religious practices. Zoroastrianism remained an important component, but it coexisted with other religious currents. The Parthian Empire, similar to the Achaemenid Empire, was religiously diverse and tolerant. This cultural openness was a strength, but it did not go hand in hand with a strong central identity. And that's exactly what became a problem over time. While the Parthians held on to power, a new movement emerged within the empire. A movement that wanted to go back to its old roots. In the south, in the region of Persis, the area of origin of the ancient Persians, a local dynasty gained influence. These rulers saw themselves as preservers of the original Persian traditions and aspired to stronger centralized power. Their goal was clear: a new Persian empire. And in the 3rd century AD, this goal was to be fulfilled. A man named Ardashir I rose up against the Parthian rule. He defeated the last Parthian king and founded a new dynasty, the Sassanids. This ended the rule of the Parthians. But her influence remained. Chapter 8 shows us a phase of return, but also of change. The Parthians brought power back into Iranian hands after the period of Greek dominance. They made a connection between the old Persian world and the new reality after Alexander. They were warriors and mediators at the same time, keepers and change-makers, a bridge between two great epochs. And even though their empire eventually fell, they laid the groundwork for what was to come next. A new Persian empire, stronger, more central and more determined. But that is the story of the next chapter. Chapter 9. The Sassanid Empire. The end of the Parthians marked the beginning of a new phase in Persian history, a phase that is often referred to as the last great heyday before the upheaval of Islam. It is the time of the Sassanid Empire, an empire that not only wanted to build on the old greatness of the Achaemenids, but also consciously tried to revive and redefine their legacy. At the center of this change was one man, Ardashir I. Ardashir was not an accidental product of history. He came from a local ruling family in Persis, the region that was considered the cultural heartland of the ancient Persians. Unlike the Parthians, whose power rested on a loose network of noble families, Ardashir pursued a clear vision, a highly centralized empire with a fixed order and a clear identity. He rose up against Parthian domination, defeated the last king and founded a new dynasty in 224 AD, the Sassanids. From the beginning, this new realm differed from its predecessor in one crucial way. While the Parthians had relied on decentralization, the Sassanids strove for control. Power was no longer to be distributed between many noble families, but was to be concentrated with the king. The ruler saw himself not only as a political leader, but as a kind of divinely legitimized king whose authority was deeply rooted in the religious order. This is where one of the central pillars of the Sassanid Empire becomes apparent: Zoroastrianism. While this religion had already played an important role under the Achaemenids, it now became an even stronger, almost state-supporting element. The Sassanid kings saw themselves as protectors and promoters of this faith. Priests were given more influence, religious institutions were expanded, and the teachings of Zarathustra were recorded and disseminated more systematically. Religion and state were closely intertwined. The king was considered the representative of the divine order on earth, and his task was to preserve this order. At the same time, this also meant that religious deviations were less tolerated than before. Although the empire remained culturally diverse, Zoroastrianism was given a privileged position that pushed other faiths into the background. But the Sassanid Empire was not only religious, it was also politically and militarily extremely ambitious. Already under Ardashir, a phase of expansion began, which was continued by his son and successor, Shapur I. Under Shapur, the empire quickly reached an impressive strength. He led successful campaigns against the Roman Empire, the great rival in the West, and was even able to capture a Roman emperor, an event that caused an enormous sensation in the ancient world. The relationship between the Sassanids and the Romans, later the Byzantines, became one of the defining conflicts of this era. For centuries, two great powers faced each other, which were roughly equally strong and fought again and again for influence in Mesopotamia and neighboring regions. These conflicts were not only military, but also ideological. Two worlds met here, the Christian Byzantine Empire and Zoroastrian Persia. This rivalry led to numerous wars that tied up enormous resources and affected the lives of many people. Cities were conquered, lost and regained, borders shifted again and again. And yet a balance remained. Neither empire could permanently defeat the other. Internally, the Sassanid Empire developed into a highly organized state. The administration was expanded, tax systems refined, and control over the provinces strengthened. Unlike the Parthians, the power of the local elites was limited, although they continued to play an important role. The king was clearly at the center of the system. The empire also experienced a heyday economically. It was located on one of the most important trade routes in the world at the time, the so-called Silk Road. Through these connections, goods, ideas, and technologies were exchanged between East and West. Persia became a central hub of this global network. Silk from China, spices from India, and products from the Mediterranean region found their way together here. This economic importance was also reflected in the culture. Cities like Ctesiphon developed into magnificent centers with impressive architecture. Large palaces, huge vaults, and artistic reliefs still bear witness to the aesthetic power of this time. Particularly famous is the monumental Taki Kisra, a huge Ivan that impressively shows the architectural mastery of the Sassanids. But the culture of the Sassanid Empire was more than just architecture. It was a time when art, literature, and science were promoted. Old traditions have been preserved and developed at the same time. The Persian identity was deliberately strengthened, as a counterpoint to external influences and as a connecting element within. Nevertheless, the empire was not free of tensions. The strong connection between religion and state also led to conflicts, especially with religious minorities. In addition, the concentration of power with the king remained a double-edged sword. A strong ruler could stabilize the empire, but weak or controversial kings quickly led to insecurity and power struggles. These problems became particularly evident in later phases of the empire. While the early Sassanid kings consolidated and expanded the empire, it became increasingly difficult to maintain this stability over time. Internal conflicts, economic burdens due to constant wars, and social tensions weakened the system. A particularly influential ruler of the later period was Khosrau I, also known as Khosrau Anaskirwan. Under his rule, the empire experienced a last major phase of reform and stability. He reorganized the administration, strengthened the military, and promoted education and science. His time is often considered the pinnacle of Sassanid culture. But even this blossoming could not fully counteract the long-term challenges. The conflicts with Byzantium escalated again and finally reached an intensity that exhausted both empires. At the same time, the world changed again. In the south, on the Arabian Peninsula, a new force emerged, at first inconspicuous, but with a dynamic that would soon change everything. The Sassanid Empire, once strong and centralized, was already weakened by this time. Internal power struggles had undermined stability, economic strains had strained the system, and the constant wars had depleted resources. When the Arab armies advanced in the 7th century, they encountered an empire that no longer had the strength to defend itself effectively. But the end of the Sassanid Empire does not mean the end of its importance. On the contrary, many of his structures, ideas, and cultural achievements lived on, even in the world that emerged afterwards. The administration, architecture, religious concepts, and the idea of a strong centralized state had a lasting influence on the subsequent empires. Chapter 9 thus shows us a last great phase of pre-Islamic Persian history. It is a time of strength and organization, of cultural flourishing and political power. But it is also a time when the limits of this system are already becoming apparent. The Sassanid Empire was the last major expression of a long development that had begun with the early cultures of the Iranian highlands. It was a highlight, and at the same time the transition to a new era. An era that was to change everything. Chapter 10: The Islamic Conquest of Persia. When the Sassanid Empire reached its limits in the 7th century AD, it was still a formidable force on the outside. Its cities were magnificent, its administration sophisticated, its culture deeply rooted. But behind this facade, a dangerous weakness had built up over the years. The constant conflict with the Byzantine Empire had devoured enormous resources, depleted the country, and undermined political stability. At the same time, internal power struggles had shaken confidence in the leadership. It was precisely in this phase of transition that a new force emerged in the south, a movement that seemed inconspicuous at first, but was soon to change the entire region. On the Arabian Peninsula, a new religious and political community had formed under the leadership of Muhammad, Islam. What began as a spiritual movement quickly developed into a dynamic political and military power after Muhammad's death in 632. The Arab tribes, who had often been at odds with each other before, now found a common identity and a common goal. This new unity gave them an energy that quickly turned outwards. The first expansions were directed against the two great powers of the region, the Byzantine Empire in the west and the Sassanid Empire in the east. For Persia, this threat came at the worst possible time. After the death of Khosrau II, the empire had entered a phase of instability. Within a few years, several rulers changed, intrigues and power struggles determined politics. The central authority was weakened, and the ability to respond to external threats was severely limited. The first encounters between the Arab troops and the Sassanid forces were still limited, but it quickly became clear that these were not ordinary border conflicts. It was the beginning of a fundamental upheaval. In 636 AD, one of the most decisive battles of this era took place, the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah. There, the forces of the Sassanid Empire met the armies of the Islamic Caliphate. Despite their military experience and numerical strength, the Persians were unable to gain a decisive advantage. The Arab troops fought with remarkable determination and discipline. Supported by a new religious conviction and a clear leadership, they succeeded in defeating the Sassanid army. This defeat was a heavy blow to the Persian Empire. Shortly afterwards, Ctesiphon, the capital of the Sassanids, fell. A center of political power and cultural significance was lost. The conquerors found riches and evidence of a centuries-old civilization there, but for the empire itself, this loss marked the beginning of its final disintegration. The last Sassanid king, Yazdijerd III, still tried to organize resistance. He retreated further and further east, gathered troops and sought support. But the situation was hopeless. He was killed in 651 AD. With his death, the Sassanid Empire ended. But the Islamic conquest of Persia was more than just a military victory. It marked a profound change in almost all areas of life. Politically, the territory of the former Persian Empire was integrated into the expanding caliphate. New administrative structures emerged, often based on existing systems that were adapted and further developed. Many Persian officials retained their functions, as their knowledge was indispensable. But the real change took place on a cultural and religious level. Islam spread gradually. Initially, however, the majority of the population remained true to their previous beliefs, especially Zoroastrianism. The Islamic rulers granted so-called owners of the book, i.e. followers of established religions, a certain protection, but demanded special taxes. Over generations, the religious landscape changed slowly. More and more people converted to Islam, whether out of conviction, for social reasons, or for practical considerations. Zoroastrianism increasingly lost importance, even if it never completely disappeared. But despite these changes, the Persian identity was not lost. On the contrary, the Persians began to combine the new religion with their own cultural traditions. They adopted Islam, but also shaped it with their own history, language, and way of thinking. A particularly important step in this process was the development of the Persian language in its new form. While Arabic became the language of religion and administration, Persian remained alive in everyday life and culture. Over time, New Persian emerged, which absorbed many Arabic influences, but still retained its own structure and identity. This linguistic development was decisive. This is because it made it possible to maintain its own cultural continuity, despite political changes. This process was also evident in literature. Persian poets and scholars began to create works that combined both Islamic and pre-Islamic elements. Stories from ancient Persian mythology were retold, historical events were processed and linked with new ideas. This created a cultural renaissance that preserved the legacy of the past and at the same time led to a new future. Persia also soon played a central role in the Islamic world scientifically and intellectually. Cities like Baghdad, although not located in today's Iran, were shaped by Persian scholars. Mathematics, medicine, philosophy, and astronomy experienced a heyday, to which many Persian thinkers made a significant contribution. This development shows that the Islamic conquest was not simply a rupture. It was a transition. A transition from one world to another, but not a complete loss of the old identity. Of course, this change has not been without conflicts. Social tensions, religious differences, and political changes repeatedly led to unrest. But over time, a new form of society emerged in which Persian tradition and Islamic religion were combined. Chapter 10 is therefore one of the most decisive phases in the entire history of Persia. It is the end of an old order, and at the same time the beginning of a new one. The Sassanid Empire disappears, but its cultural and administrative structures live on. Zoroastrianism is losing importance, but its ideas continue to influence thought. Islam becomes the dominant religion, but it is lived in a way that is shaped by Persian history. This combination of continuity and change is what makes this epoch so special, because it shows that even far-reaching changes do not necessarily have to lead to a complete break. Sometimes such upheavals give rise to new forms, new identities, new cultures, new ways of thinking. And that's exactly what happens here. The history of Persia continues. Different than before, but no less significant. And in the next chapter, we will see how this new world develops and what role Persia plays in it. Chapter 11. Persia in the Middle Ages. After the Islamic conquest of Persia, there was no phase of stagnation, quite the opposite. It was the beginning of a profound transformation that reshaped the country not only politically, but above all culturally and intellectually. The former core of a pre-Islamic empire became a central part of the Islamic world, and at the same time a motor of its development. The first centuries after the conquest were marked by adaptation and change. Under the early caliphates, especially the Umayyads and later the Abbasids, Persia was integrated into a far-reaching political system. The administration was increasingly in Arabic, and political power was initially outside Persia. But beneath the surface, something crucial began to develop. Persian culture did not disappear, it changed. Over time, Persian elites regained influence, especially among the Abbasids, whose capital Baghdad became a center of scholarship. Many of the most important thinkers, scientists, and officials of this era came from Persian regions. They contributed not only their knowledge, but also their cultural traditions. This resulted in a new synthesis, an Islamic civilization with a strong Persian character. A central aspect of this development was the revival of the Persian language. While Arabic continued to be the language of religion and science, New Persian developed into an important literary language. It was written in Arabic script, incorporated numerous Arabic terms, but remained independent in its structure. This linguistic rebirth was more than just a cultural phenomenon. It was an expression of identity. And it found perhaps its most impressive expression in a work that is still considered one of the most important literary works in the world, the Shahnameh by Ferdowsi. In this monumental epic, Ferdowsi tells the story of the Persian kings, from mythical beginnings to the Islamic conquest. It is a conscious return to the pre-Islamic past, a celebration of one's own history and culture. But at the same time, it is a work that was created in an Islamic world, a symbol of the connection between past and present. In addition to literature, science and philosophy also experienced an extraordinary flourishing. Persia became a center of knowledge. One of the most outstanding thinkers of this period was Avicenna, also known as Ibn Sina. He was a doctor, philosopher, mathematician, and much more. His work Canon of Medicine remained a standard work for centuries, not only in the Islamic world, but also in Europe. Avicenna combined Greek philosophy, especially the teachings of Aristotle, with Islamic thought, creating a new intellectual system. His works show how open and dynamic the intellectual world of that time was. Another important thinker was al-Biruni, who studied astronomy, geography, mathematics, and history. His works testify to a remarkable curiosity and a deep understanding of different cultures. These scholars did not stand in isolation. They were part of a larger network of schools, libraries, and scholars. Knowledge was collected, translated, discussed, and further developed. Ancient texts from Greece, India, and Persia have been preserved and reinterpreted. But this intellectual flowering was closely linked to political developments. In the course of the Middle Ages, various dynasties arose in the territory of former Persia, often acting independently of the caliphate. One of the first was that of the Sassanids, who controlled large parts of Central Asia and Iran in the 9th and 10th centuries. Under her rule, Persian culture was specifically promoted. They supported poets, scholars, and artists and contributed significantly to the revival of Persian identity. Later, other dynasties followed, including the Buyids and the Ghaznavids, each of whom set their own priorities, but also contributed to cultural development. This time was characterized by diversity. Politically, there was no unified rule, but a multitude of empires and dominions. But culturally, an astonishing continuity developed. Persia remained a center. Religion also continued to develop. Islam had long since become the dominant faith, but various currents emerged within Islam. Shiite Islam in particular gained importance in some regions and would later play a central role in the history of Persia. At the same time, a spiritual movement developed that stood out from formal religious life: Sufism. Sufis sought a direct, personal connection to God. They emphasized inner experience, love, and devotion. Her teachings were well received and influenced the religious practice of many people. This spirituality was also reflected in poetry. Poets like Rumi created works of deep emotional and philosophical power. His poems, which deal with love, longing, and the search for the divine, are still known worldwide today. But despite all these cultural and intellectual developments, the Middle Ages in Persia were not free of crises. In the 13th century, a new threat shook the region: the Mongols. Under the leadership of Genghis Khan, they invaded the Islamic world and left a trail of destruction in their wake. Cities were destroyed, libraries burned, entire regions devastated. Persia was not spared either. But even this catastrophe did not mean the end. On the contrary, after the first phase of destruction, a new construction began. The Mongols adopted many elements of Persian culture and administration. Under the Ilkhans, a Mongol dynasty in Persia, the region once again experienced a period of stabilization and cultural development. This ability to adapt and renew is a central feature of Persian history. Again and again, the country has been conquered, changed, challenged, and again it has found ways to preserve and reshape its identity. Chapter 11 therefore shows us one of the most fascinating phases of this story. It is a time when Persia does not exist as an independent empire, and yet plays a central role. A time in which culture, knowledge, and identity have a stronger effect than political borders. And a time in which the foundations are laid for much that will follow later. For out of this medieval world a new Persia arises. A Persia that knows its past, shapes its present, and is ready for the next great phase of its history. Chapter 12: The Safavid Dynasty. After centuries of political fragmentation, changing rulers, and cultural flourishing without a permanently united empire, a new phase in the history of Persia began in the early 16th century. It was a phase in which political power, religious identity, and cultural self-image were combined in a new decisive way. At the center of this upheaval was a dynasty that not only reunited Persia, but also gave it a new direction: the Safavids. Her rise is closely linked to a charismatic figure, Ismail I. Ismail was no ordinary leader. He came from a religious movement that had originally emerged from a Sufi order. This movement had developed over generations and built up a growing following. When Ismail came to the top, he combined religious conviction with political ambition and created a force that was to fundamentally change Persia. In 1501, Ismail conquered the city of Tabriz and had himself crowned Shah. This officially began the rule of the Safavids. But his claim went far beyond the control of individual regions. He wanted to create a united Persia, an empire that was not only politically but also religiously and culturally connected. Perhaps the most consequential step in this process was the introduction of Shiite Islam as the state religion. Until then, Persia, like large parts of the Islamic world, had been predominantly Sunni. With a single political decision, Ismail changed this balance. 12-verse Shurism was declared the official religion, and its spread was actively promoted. This step had profound consequences. He created a clear religious identity that distinguished Persia from its neighbors, especially the powerful Ottoman Empire in the west, which was Sunni in character. At the same time, however, it also led to tensions and conflicts, both within the country and with other powers. The introduction of Shurism was not a smooth process. Many regions first had to be convinced or forced to accept the new faith. Religious scholars were brought to Persia from other parts of the Islamic world to establish and consolidate the new order. But over time, Shiite Islam became a central part of Persian identity, a development that continues to have an impact today. Politically, the Safavids succeeded in stabilizing and centralizing the country. After centuries of fragmentation, a unified state emerged again. The administration was expanded. control over the provinces strengthened and the power of the Shah consolidated. A particularly important ruler of this dynasty was Abbas I, also known as Abbas the Great. Under his rule, the Safavid Empire reached a climax. Abbas recognized that a strong empire requires not only military strength, but also economic and cultural development. He reformed the military by building a standing army that was less dependent on traditional tribal forces. This reform strengthened central power and reduced the influence of local elites. He also set new economic impulses. He promoted trade, especially along the Silk Road, and opened up the empire to international relations. European traders and envoys came to Persia, new trade connections were established, and the country became an important hub in global exchange. A visible sign of this heyday was the expansion of the capital Isfahan. Under Abbas, Isfahan became one of the most beautiful cities in the world. Large squares, magnificent mosques, ornate palaces, and extensive gardens shaped the cityscape. The architecture of this period combined functionality with aesthetic sophistication and reflected the claim of the empire. The famous Imam Mosque, Nakshi Jahan Square, and numerous other buildings still bear witness to this cultural heyday. But the Safavids were not only builders, they were also promoters of art and culture. Miniature painting, carpet art, calligraphy, and literature experienced a new blossoming. Persian carpets became sought-after luxury goods. Their patterns and techniques reached a level that is still admired today. Literature also continued to develop, characterized by a mixture of religious, mystical, and secular themes. Sufism continued to be an important part of intellectual life, even though the official religion became more institutionalized. But despite all these successes, the Safavid Empire was not free of problems. The strong centralization brought stability, but also made the system dependent on the strength of the respective ruler. After the death of Abbas I, personalities of comparable ability were often missing. Intrigues at court, power struggles, and inefficient administration increasingly weakened the empire. Militarily, too, the balance was shaken. The conflicts with the Ottoman Empire in the west and the Uzbeks in the east put a strain on resources. At the same time, the world changed. New trade routes across the sea gained in importance, causing the traditional land routes to lose influence. These developments affected the Safavid Empire economically. In the 18th century, the crisis reached its peak. Internal weakness and external attacks eventually led to the collapse of the dynasty. Afghan troops conquered Isfahan, and the Safavids lost control of their empire. But even when their political rule ended, their influence remained. Because the Safavids had created something that went far beyond their time. They had given Persia a new identity. The connection between the state and Shiite Islam, which they established, still shapes the country today. The cultural achievements of their time, in architecture, art, and society, also continue to have an effect. Chapter 12, therefore, shows us a phase of rebirth. After centuries of fragmentation, a new united Persia emerges. A state with a clear structure, strong identity, and cultural flourishing. But at the same time, it is also a system that remains susceptible to internal weaknesses and external changes. The Safavids are thus more than just a dynasty. They are a turning point, a moment in which the past and the future connect, and from which a new Persia emerges, which continues to have an effect to the present day. Chapter 13, Between Tradition and Modernity, the Qajars and the Influence of Europe. After the collapse of the Safavids and a period of political instability in which various rulers struggled for control of Persia, a new era began in the late 18th century. A new dynasty came to power and tried to bring order to a fragmented country, the Qajars. They marked the beginning of a time marked by a deep field of tension between centuries-old tradition and the ever-increasing influences of a rapidly changing world. This dynasty was founded by Aga Muhammad Khan. He was a feared and determined figure who managed to regain control of large parts of Persia and establish himself as Shah. But his empire was no longer the powerful, stable structure of the Safavid period. It was a country that had to reorient itself. in a world that was becoming increasingly globalized. It became clear early on that the greatest challenge of the Qajars was not only internal, but came from without. Europe was in a state of change. Industrialization began, new technologies emerged, and the European powers continued to expand their influence. Two empires in particular were to become crucial for Persia: the Russian Empire in the north and the British Empire in the south. These two powers pursued their own interests, and Persia got caught between them. In the so-called Great Game, the country became a geopolitical pawn. Russia wanted to expand its influence southwards, while Britain wanted to secure its position in India. Persia was right in between. This situation led to a series of conflicts and political concessions. Under the rule of Fath Ali Shah, there were several wars with Russia. The results were devastating for Persia. Large areas in the Caucasus were lost, and the country had to accept treaties that limited its sovereignty. These defeats made it clear how far Persia had fallen behind the European powers technologically and militarily. But they also led to a growing awareness: something had to change. In the course of the 19th century, the first attempts to modernize the country began. Reforms were initiated, European ideas were introduced, and contacts with the West were intensified. Persian students were sent abroad to acquire new knowledge, and European advisors were invited to help build modern structures. But this process was anything but easy, because every change met with resistance. The traditional society of Persia was deeply rooted in religious, social, and cultural structures. Many saw the reforms as a threat to their identity and way of life. The religious authorities in particular were often critical of Western influences. This created a field of tension that shaped the entire era. On the one hand, there were the reform forces that sought to modernize the state. On the other side were conservative forces that wanted to hold on to the existing structures. These tensions were particularly evident under Nasir ad-Din Shah, one of the best-known rulers of the Qajar period. He ruled for several decades and was fascinated by Europe. He traveled there himself, visiting cities such as Paris and London, and trying to bring some of the ideas he saw there to Persia. Under his rule, the first modern institutions were created, including schools, newspapers, and state reforms. But at the same time, his rule remained authoritarian. Many reforms were implemented only half-heartedly, and corruption and mismanagement remained widespread. In addition, the Shah increasingly granted economic concessions to foreign powers, for example, for the construction of railways or the use of resources. Although these concessions brought in short-term revenues, they led to growing dissatisfaction among the population in the long term, because many Persians had the feeling that their land was being sold. A particularly well-known example is the tobacco concession of 1890, in which a British company was given a monopoly on the tobacco trade. This decision triggered massive protests, up to and including a religious boycott, which ultimately led to the withdrawal of the concession. This event showed something decisive. The population began to organize. For the first time, it became clear that not only the Shah and the elites determined the fate of the country, but also the people could exert influence. This development ultimately led to one of the most important events of this era, the Constitutional Revolution of 1905 to 1911. In this movement, various groups, merchants, clergy, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens, demanded a limitation of royal power and the introduction of a constitution. It was a decisive step towards a more modern political system. A parliament was established, a constitution was adopted, and for the first time there were beginnings of a separation of powers. But even these achievements did not last. Internal conflicts, foreign interference, and political instability prevented the reforms from being implemented in a sustainable way. Russia and Great Britain repeatedly intervened in internal affairs to secure their own interests. Thus, Persia remained trapped in a field of tension that could not be easily resolved. The Qajar period was therefore not an epoch of clear progress or clear regression. It was a transitional phase, a time in which old structures slowly broke down, without being immediately replaced by new ones. A time in which ideas of freedom, modernization, and national identity emerged, but could not yet be fully implemented. But it is precisely in this incompleteness that its significance lies. Because the developments of this time laid the foundation for everything that was to follow. The confrontation with Europe, the question of one's own identity, the desire for reform and the role of the people in politics, all these issues were to play an even greater role in the 20th century. Chapter 13 thus shows us a Persia in transition, a country between the past and the future, between external influences and inner resistance, between the desire for preservation and the urge for change. And it is precisely out of this field of tension that the next phase of the story emerges. A phase in which an attempt is being made to fundamentally transform the country. But at what price? We will see in the next chapter. Chapter 14, the Pahlavi Era. When the 20th century began, Persia was in a state of profound uncertainty. The Qajars had not managed to stabilize the country in the long term or to overcome the challenges of modernity. Political instability, economic dependence on foreign powers, and a weak central government had shaken the confidence of many people. At the same time, the constitutional movement had created a new consciousness, the desire for a strong modern state that is independent and capable of acting. It was precisely in this situation that a man appeared on the scene who promised to create order and fundamentally change the country, Reza Shah Pahlavi. Reza Shah was not a member of the old elite. He came from a humble background and had worked his way up in the military. In 1921, he led a coup d'état that initially appeared to be an attempt to create stability. But it soon became clear that he wanted more. In 1925, he deposed the Qajar dynasty and had himself crowned Shah. This marked the beginning of the Pahlavi era. His goal was clear. He wanted to modernize Persia, centralize it, and make it a strong nation-state. In doing so, he oriented himself in many respects on European models, especially on Turkey under Ataturk. But unlike there, the transformation in Persia took place from above, authoritarian, controlled, and often without regard for existing structures. Reza Shah began a series of comprehensive reforms. The power of traditional elites, especially tribal leaders and religious authorities, was limited. A centralized administrative system was set up to strengthen the state's control over the entire country. Roads, railways, and other infrastructure projects have been advanced to promote economic development and better connect the country. Important steps have also been taken in the field of education. New schools and universities were built, a state education system was established, and access to knowledge was to be expanded. The aim was to create a new generation, educated, modern, and loyal to the state. A particularly symbolic step was the renaming of the country in 1935. Persia officially became Iran. This name, which means land of the Aryans, was intended to strengthen the national identity and emphasize the connection to its own history. But the modernization had its price. Many of the reforms had a deep impact on people's lives. Traditional clothing was banned or restricted, Western clothing was promoted. The ban on the veil for women was particularly controversial, a step that was intended as progress, but was perceived by many as a constraint. Religious institutions lost influence, which led to tensions. The authoritarian nature of the implementation left little room for resistance or discussion. Opposition was suppressed, political freedom severely restricted. The result was a state that seemed modern, but was based on a fragile balance. This balance was shaken by an event that went far beyond Iran's borders: World War II. Iran was strategically important, both for the Allies and for the Axis powers. Due to its location and resources, the country became the focus of international interests. In 1941, British and Soviet troops marched in to prevent a possible rapprochement between Iran and Germany. Reza Shah was forced to abdicate. His son took power, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. He marked the beginning of a new phase in the Pahlavi era, a phase that was initially marked by uncertainty, but would later develop into one of the most controversial periods in Iranian history. Mohammad Reza Shah was less dominant than his father, at least at the beginning. The political landscape was more open, different groups struggled for influence, and parliament played a greater role. But this phase of relative openness was short-lived. A central event was the reign of Muhammad Mossadegh, who tried to regain control of Iran's oil resources in the early 1950s. The nationalization of the oil industry was a symbolic act of national sovereignty, but it led to a conflict with Britain and the US. In 1953, there was a decisive turning point. In a coup supported by foreign intelligence services, Mossadegh was overthrown, and the Shah regained full control of the country. This event had a profound impact on the population's trust, especially in the West and their own government. In the years that followed, Mohammad Reza Shah continued to expand his power. He established an authoritarian system that was geared towards control and stability. At the same time, he continued the modernization policy, but now on an even larger scale. A central program was the so-called White Revolution in the 1960s. These were a series of reforms that included land reform, the promotion of education, the introduction of women's suffrage, and economic modernization measures. These reforms led to visible changes. Cities grew, industries emerged, and the country continued to develop economically. A new middle class emerged, and many people benefited from the new opportunities. But at the same time, social tensions intensified. The reforms were implemented from above, without broad social participation. Many traditional structures have been broken up without new stable alternatives emerging. The gap between urban and rural areas grew, as did the differences between rich and poor. Another decisive factor was political repression. The secret police, known as Savak, monitored the population, suppressed opposition, and created a climate of fear. Criticism of the regime was hardly tolerated, and many political opponents were persecuted. In this environment, resistance began to form. Different groups, from intellectuals to students to religious leaders, increasingly voiced criticism. The religious opposition, in particular, gained prominence as it offered an alternative vision that emphasized both social justice and cultural identity. One name that became increasingly important in this context was Ruhollah Khomeini. He openly criticized the Shah's policies, especially the close connection to the West and the neglect of religious values. His messages were increasingly heard, even among those who felt excluded from social changes. Tensions increased. In the 1970s, the situation worsened further. Despite economic growth, especially due to rising oil prices, dissatisfaction persisted. Corruption, inequality, and political repression led to growing protests. Eventually, there was a broad movement that united various social groups. The Pahlavi Era was nearing its end. Chapter 14 thus shows us a time of profound change. A country is trying to modernize itself and keep up with the world. A state is being built, reformed, and strengthened, but at the same time new tensions are emerging. Progress and control go hand in hand, but the balance remains fragile. The Pahlavi Era is marked by ambitions and contradictions, of visions and conflicts, and it leads directly to an event that will fundamentally change the history of Iran. But that is the story of the next chapter. Chapter 15, The Islamic Revolution and Iran Today. At the end of the Pahlavi Era, there was a state that appeared modern on the outside, had grown economically, and was regarded internationally as an important partner, and yet was marked by deep tensions internally. The reforms had changed the country, but they had also created new fractures. Many people feel excluded, their cultural and religious values disregarded, their political voice suppressed. This mixture of dissatisfaction, hope, and resistance gave rise to a movement that would eventually change everything. At the center of this movement was a figure who had repeatedly voiced criticism of the regime in previous years, Ruhollah Khomeini. Khomeini was no ordinary oppositionist. He was a religious scholar whose influence extended far beyond political circles. His criticism was directed not only against individual measures of the Shah, but against the entire system. He condemned the close connection to the West, the increasing secularization, and the social inequality in the country. He had already been forced into exile in the 1960s. But even from there he remained present. His messages were recorded, duplicated, and spread throughout the country. He found more and more supporters, especially among students, religious circles, and parts of the population who felt alienated by the changes of the Pahlavi period. In the late 1970s, the situation came to a head. Economic problems, rising prices, and unemployment increased discontent. At the same time, the regime responded to protests with harsh repression. Demonstrations were violently dispersed, critics persecuted. But instead of stopping the movement, this violence led to further escalation. The protests became larger, more organized, and broader. Different social groups joined forces: religious leaders, intellectuals, workers, students, and parts of the middle class. What united them was not necessarily a shared vision for the future, but a rejection of the existing system. This development reached its peak in 1979. After months of protests, strikes, and unrest, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi left the country. Shortly thereafter, Khomeini returned from exile and was welcomed by millions of people. It was a moment of historic significance. The monarchy that had shaped the country for decades had fallen. It was replaced by a new system, the Islamic Republic. This new system was unique. It combined elements of a republic, such as elections and political institutions, with religious leadership. The focus was on the concept of the rule of the jurist, which Khomeini developed. According to this, a religious leader should hold the highest authority in the state to ensure that politics is in line with Islamic principles. Khomeini became the supreme leader. This marked the beginning of a new phase in Iran's history, a phase that continues to this day. But the transition was not easy. After the revolution, there was initially a phase of reorganization. Old structures were dissolved, new institutions created. At the same time, political opponents were excluded or persecuted. The diversity of the revolutionary movement increasingly gave way to a clearer ideological orientation. Another event had a decisive impact on this time: the hostage-taking in the U.S. Embassy in Tehran in 1979. This event led to a massive break with the United States and shaped Iran's foreign policy orientation for decades. Relations with the West became increasingly tense. Mistrust and conflicts determined relations. Shortly thereafter, the country faced another challenge. In 1980, the Iran-Iraq War began. Under the leadership of Saddam Hussein, Iraq attacked Iran. The war lasted 8 years and developed into one of the most costly conflicts of the 20th century. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives. Entire regions were destroyed. But this war also had a domestic political effect. He strengthened cohesion in the country and consolidated the new order. Defense against an external enemy became a unifying element that pushed many internal conflicts into the background. After the death of Khomeini in 1989, a new phase began. The leadership passed to Ali Khamenei, who still holds this office today. Under his leadership, the political system continued to develop, but its basic structures remained. Iran became a state with complex power relations. There are elected institutions such as parliament and the president, but also unelected bodies that have a lot of influence. The supreme leader stands above the political system and has a decisive influence on central decisions. This structure repeatedly leads to tensions. Reform-oriented forces are trying to achieve more openness and change, while conservative forces want to preserve the existing structures. This dynamic continues to shape the country's domestic politics to this day. Iran has also changed a lot socially. The population is young, well-educated, and increasingly networked. Cities like Tehran are modern metropolises where tradition and modernity meet. Women play an important role in education and in many areas of society, even though their rights remain restricted. At the same time, many questions remain unanswered. Relations with the West remain tense, especially due to political differences and international conflicts. Economic challenges, sanctions, and internal problems affect the lives of many people. But despite all these challenges, one thing remains constant: Iran's ability to adapt and evolve. Chapter 15 is therefore not just a conclusion, it is an open end. It shows us a country that is constantly reinventing itself. A country that is shaped by its history, but does not stop in it. A country where the past and present are in constant dialogue with each other. From the early cultures of the Iranian highlands to the modern Islamic Republic, there is an arc that spans thousands of years. Empires have arisen and fallen, religions have changed, cultures have grown and mixed. And yet there is continuity. An identity that runs through all these changes. The history of Persia is not a linear development. It is a web of ruptures and connections, of change and permanence. And perhaps this is precisely where her greatest strength lies. Because it shows us that even in times of deepest change, something can remain. An idea, a culture, a sense of belonging. And it is precisely this story that will continue to be written in the future.